property rights system that make an open access society work. So you have a basic dilemma with respect to aid, which has made aid so that in general it's been counterproductive.
But can I elaborate on this, Douglas, just so I understand? But the issue is that very often people have spoken about aid being ineffective because it perpetuates elites. But you're saying something deeper than that. You're sort of saying it's not simply a question of perpetuating elites, it's a question of even if you could structure it so that you would undermine the elites, it would undermine them unproductively. In other words, it would remove the very thing providing stability without providing conditions for a viable open access society.
One of the things we do in the book, which I really like and we should have done more with, is we look at the progression from in limited access society, what we call a fragile limited access society, to a stable, to a mature one. And it's the institutional evolution that moves you. And one of the things we argue in the book, and I feel very strongly about, is you cannot have either a fragile or a stable limited access society evolve immediately into open access, because they've got to evolve the institutional framework to a mature one, and then what we call the doorstep conditions that will allow you to go into open access. And so if you try to shortcut that, which is what we're trying to do in Iraq and places like that, and we're clearly going to fail. And I've been saying this for a long time ago, but you cannot simply take a society, in the case of Iraq, which is a fragile limited access society, and make it overnight into a open access society, which is what we're still trying to do, and it's stupid. You cannot create a viable democracy, for example, is a meaningful one, back to what Claire was talking about, without creating a whole set of institutional structures that will be complementary to the political structure that will allow it to be stable. And we don't understand that. So the book has enormous implications for how we should be thinking about aid and development.
I'm Dave Bueller. I'm a first-year master's student.
Remember, you got to talk loud because I'm deaf, and slowly because I'm still deaf.
I'm Dave Bueller. I'm a first-year master's student. My question relates to what you were just talking about a little bit. What do you feel about war as a means of preserving social order? Is it a necessary evil, or will it lead to disorder? And not just with Reconstruction, but total war. And
boy, that's a modest question. I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. In general, I don't think that the outcome of wars typically are an improvement. That's not always true. I can think of cases where the outcome of a war has improved society's well-being. Certainly, but if I take a look at most recent efforts of the United States in war, I mean, go back over my lifetime, the Vietnam War. When we agreed to go into Vietnam, we went in because of the fact that if we didn't go in, all of Asia was going to be toppled into a communist system. And indeed, it was a domino effect, which was the way it was caught. But the domino effect, remember, we lost the war, and what's happened? They're all trying to become capitalists at this point, or imitate what we're doing. So it was clearly a war that didn't work. I think the Vietnam War was the Iraq War is the same thing. So it's hard for me to be able to generalize about that. I don't think that the reasons we've gone into wars have typically been ones that out of it would create more dynamic and productive society, open access society. But I'd hesitate to generalize it all through history, because if we go back through history, I can think of all kinds of times when wars probably have improved the condition of human beings after killing off quite a few people, of course.
Questions? Yes. No.
Nakul Kumar, second year PhD student. Professor, now this might sound a little vague, but
Louder.
This might sound a little vague, but I started thinking about this when I read the paper, The Natural State. And I was just wondering, how would you perceive the ideal change in institutions that govern how politicians interact with the electorate as economies move from a state of underdevelopment to the more open access societies?
Did you understand the question?
No.
If he doesn't understand it, I never understand it.
How would you perceive the ideal change in the institutional structure that governs the relationship between politicians and the electorate as societies move from a state of underdevelopment to being more open access societies?
Well, I think what I do understand the question now. I think when you have a limited access society, the first thing you want to understand is where does that society stand with respect to this really a hierarchy from fragile to mature limited access society. And then once you do know where you are, then you got to ask what kind of incremental institutional change can I make that'll move us in the direction of becoming mature. Or if you're mature, it will move you to the doorstep condition, which I haven't talked about. So, but I think we're beginning to know enough so that once we know that, we could make sense out of being helpful to countries rather than, I think, having done more harm than good.
Yes, back there.
Dan Smith, a second-year PhD student. I wanted to ask you, what role do you think that religious, ethnic, and linguistic fractionalization plays in preventing limited access societies from achieving the doorstep conditions necessary to move to an open access society?
Again, I didn't.
What role do religious conflicts or ethnic conflicts
that's a good-
play in terms of preventing these adjustments?
Thank you. That's a complex question. One of the things that I'm serious. One of the things that we don't know enough about, I don't think we know enough about, and this goes back to when I talked about cognitive science, is the way in which belief systems evolve. And belief systems reflect and anticipate the kind of institutional changes that you're going to have, because you've got to have a change in a belief system. You've got a belief system that reflects where you are today. It's only going to change if you change beliefs about what works. And so one of the things that we don't know a lot about is how do belief systems evolve through time? Why do they evolve the way they do? Why, in the case of, to take a modern day real life problem, fundamentalist Muslim countries, how can we change belief systems there so that they can be willing to adapt institutions that are more accessible to institutions that will improve their lot. And there's a lot we don't know about that yet. So the beginning of and I think I started with this, the beginning of what we want to do is to understand more about how belief systems lead to how they change and what kind of things make them change the way they do. One of the things, for example, that we observe, and it's confusing, we observe sometimes that certain kinds of institutional change occur very rapidly and appear to just disappear overnight. Other kinds of institutional change take a long time to change. Why they do, we really don't know. What makes them hang on in certain respects? Well, Muslim fundamentalism has a variety of institutional characteristics that make it antithetical to really getting societies to improve their lot. And one of the things we'd like to know is why they hang on the way they do. And we are a long ways from understanding that completely.
Back there.
My name is Carl Oberg. I'm a master's student in my last semester. I have a question about, you talked about adaptive efficiency earlier. Is there a point at which institutional change is happening so rapidly that the level of uncertainty basically increases to a level that people aren't able to go forward anymore, economic growth stops? So is there a point where there's too much of a good thing from an open society Yeah.
That's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer. It's something I'm very interested in because quite clearly right now, or in the last 15 years, we've had a very rapid change in lots of organizations, lots of institutions. And one of the things we're interested in is, does that produce more instability down the road, or so much instability that we can't handle it? And I don't have an answer to that question, but I wish I did. You better get one.
Others? Jason, good?
Yeah, Jason Aarons again. In your previous work, you focused some on the monarch as monopolist, and you seem to have retreated from that a little bit. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on your present opinions about the monarch as monopolist model.
Well, Barry and I wrote an article one time on this subject, which became quite famous. In fact, it was the most cited article in all of political science for quite a long time. I don't think it's quite correct now. I think it's mostly correct. But what we were looking at was the way in which monarchies evolved over time, particularly England and to some extent France and other countries, and what made for the gradual breakdown. Now, the reason why I'm dissatisfied with it now is that ours was an oversimple explanation, which was particularly focused around the English Glorious Revolution and the Revolution of 1688. A lot of people now come along, and I think rightly pointed out that we didn't give enough credence to changes that had gone on before that, particularly in property rights structures and land, and to things like that, which we do in the new book. We have a 100-page story about the change in property rights and land law in England and in France and in that period. And I think we've done a much better job of understanding that process much better than we did before.
Astrid Arca, first year master's student. I'm wondering what institutional qualities would you say either perpetuate conflict or make it escalate into bad state?
Well, I suppose, and this is a lousy answer, you understand, but it's a start, where you have fundamentally antithetical positions with respect to people, and people perceive it in their interest to hold those positions so strongly that they're willing to kill other people for it, which is really what is the source of violence. So ideally what you'd like, and something that we don't do in the case of American development in recent years, is we have tended, and I'm exaggerating that, but we tend to kill off people who disagree with us. And I think one of the things we should do is we've got to understand different positions. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them, and certainly doesn't mean that we have to let people kill us off or with terrorists, but it does mean you try to understand why people hold the positions they do, what makes them so convinced that they're crucial, and why we hold the positions that we do. And until we have a earnest dialogue about that, where we have fundamental differences, like what we have today with Islamic fundamentalism, we're not going to get anywhere in trying to mediate them. It doesn't mean you give in. It means you try to understand them and see the degree to which, with incremental changes, we can change them in both directions to make it so we can live with each other.
Yes, back there.
Harry David, first year PhD student. I'm wondering about how societies achieve the Dorset conditions, and
I can't hear you.
I'm thinking about how societies tend to achieve the Dorset conditions, and I want to ask you to compare your work to another work, and I'm not very familiar with either that work or yours, so I'm kind of hoping that you know it better than I do. But Ekelund and Tollison in Mercantilism as the Rent-Seeking Society. Well, actually, let me set the problem up first. From what I know of your work, you basically say that for those conditions to be achieved, the elites have to recognize that the intra-elite conflict and competition is costly enough that they would benefit to have their privileges understood as impersonal rights or whatever than privileges, right? And so it sounds sort of like it's an ideological change in the elites that requires it. But maybe I'm wrong about that. But that if that is the case, that's definitely different from the idea that those conditions are that the transition comes when there's like some kind of a competition between elites for the satisfaction of rent seekers, maybe so that by having like a legislature compete with a local council or whatever, that in trying to extract rents, that a process is set in motion where these impersonal rights are more and more established, and open access is more established. So I'm wondering if you could compare those.
I think let me ask the question more simply. Do you think
Sorry.
that when the elites acknowledge the importance of impersonal exchange or impersonal rights, is that primarily an ideological transformation, or is it often something forced on them through a process of competition, either political or otherwise?
Yeah.
All right, because that's actually the difference between Acemoglu and us. Acemoglu and
Johnson and Robinson.
believe that elites were forced to make the changes that they did because of pressure from beneath. We do not believe that. So we believe that you so evolved institutions that it was in the self-interest of elites to extend citizenship and rights to a broader group, because it widened at least the income that they accrued to in the short run. And we have a lot of evidence that suggests that we're right about that. Well, I'm not sure I've convinced Acemoglu and Robinson about it, but I think it's a good issue, and it's one I don't feel strongly that in every case we're right. I think in some cases it may very well have been forced from beneath. But the ones that we've seen, we think generally fit the model we have better.
Yes.
My name is Roxanne Alvarez. I'm a first-year master's student. I think I understood earlier in your talk you said that, I think it was regarding institutional studies, that sociology and anthropology had asked good questions but had gotten crappy answers.
I think that's my exact words.
Yeah, and they caught my attention. I'm just wondering, do you think that has to do with their research methods, or is there another reason you think so, that they haven't succeeded in better understanding institutions?
Well, this would launch me off into at least a 6-hour discussion about the way in which the disciplines have evolved. And I'm serious for a minute, because the disciplines have evolved in terms of starting out with it and sort of evolving on that without taking into account a broader horizon. One of the things I think that has hampered anthropology and sociology is that they tend to be self-contained with, I think, a very limited view about the way in which the human mind works and things, and have not broadened out. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to broaden out the understanding to incorporate a lot of beliefs that come from other disciplines. And I think that economics has a lot to offer. In fact, one of the reasons why economics has become the dominant social science is very easy. It had a framework that was logically, internally consistent, that explained a great deal and appeared to make a lot of sense out of a lot of things, even if there was a lot left out. And it made it so that it was a very attractive, it came to dominate, as it does today, political science in good part. And it's gradually coming, not necessarily for good reasons, to dominate some of what's going on in anthropology and sociology. But one of the things that I'm fumbling with is, again, we don't know enough about it, but how do belief systems evolve again, and what makes them incorporate new ideas as they go along? And I don't have a very good answer other than what I've been talking about. But it's a good question. I expect you to do better.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi. So, at the beginning of your talk, you sketched. Oh, Emily Schaefer. I just completed my PhD here at George Mason. So, at the beginning of your talk, you sketched this relationship between formal institutions being determined in large part by the overarching political institutions. Where do you see the role of informal institutions in influencing either of these two structures? And secondly, do you equate culture with informal institutions, or do you see culture as being something categorically different?
I define culture as the set of beliefs and institutions inherited from the past that constrain the choice set in the present. You notice that I've tied it into economic theory. That's economics is a theory of choice. And that's deliberate because I think that's the right way to think about it. It doesn't answer your question completely, but it does make it so that culture becomes then a major part of my framework. I talk about culture because one of the things that makes economists look like jackasses in the world is that they don't understand that the choice set you have in today is severely limited by where you've been and the kind of institutions and beliefs that you've inherited from the past. And that's the beginning of wisdom. And you don't get it in economics. And that's crazy because clearly you don't have a choice that's wide open. You have a choice that is very narrowly constrained by the kind of things that we've inherited in the past that are what we mean by culture. And so it's terribly important to consider culture. Then what we got to have a better understanding is how the beliefs and institutions, why certain ones survive, why they get perpetuated, why some others get discarded, all of which are grist for our mill of what we have to understand about institutional change.
Yes.
William Luther, I'm a first-year PhD student. Just to follow up on this question on this comment that you just made about being constrained by culture, would you say that as travel becomes even more cheaper and moving from one culture to another it becomes less costly, that this idea of constrained by culture will be less relevant?
I'd like to be able to say yes, and I think maybe there's some evidence, but I'm just not sure. We're still killing each other in the world with great abandon, and we've certainly lowered the cost of information, we've lowered the cost of travel. We have much more integration of societies than we had in the past. And I think that certainly helps, but how much it helps, I really don't know. What do you think?
Well, I actually think it could work the opposite. In other words, if you discuss culture in terms of ignorance about the other side, then to the extent that travel or greater information helps that, it will ameliorate it. In contrast, to the extent I merely suspect you're different and weird, I'm less likely to kill you than if I meet you and know for sure you're different and weird. So it's not at all. I'm unpersuaded. To the extent that I have a strong belief that my identity is tied to certain aspects of my belief, and those beliefs are either excluded by or denied by you, then I would argue there are situations under which greater self-awareness or greater awareness or mutual understanding leads to more mutual conflict, not less.
Well, I'm not sure I'd agree with you, but I'd have to think about it. But it's a good point. You can understand why we have a lot of fun teaching together all the time. We fight with each other all the time.
Questions? Yes.
Deanna Vinard. I'm a fourth-year PhD student. This is another argument by Acemoglu in a 2002 paper, The Rise of the Regulatory State. I'm not sure who his co-authors are, but they make the argument that the progressive era and the rise of regulation were adaptively efficient, or an adaptively efficient response to the rise of corporations in this country. And I'm wondering, you said earlier that the rise of regulation and redistribution and competition for rents actually undermines the open access society. Do you think that Acemoglu is right that that regulation can sometimes be adaptively efficient, or do you think it's always undermining?
Well, no, I think it's both. I mean, I think sometimes it can be adaptively efficient, but a lot of times, of course, it's not. It's the device to create monopoly rents for the. But certainly, one of the things that makes it so that right-wingers in the world are crazy, not looking at anybody in particular, is that I think that and I've said this earlier, I think that you need to, there's no such thing as laissez-faire. You need to structure economies in ways that it provide incentives and disincentives for people to be productive and creative. That's going to change with time. It's going to change with all kinds of things that are going on, so that it's not a constant. You've got to keep on evolving them. What worked yesterday isn't going to work tomorrow.
Right. Can I ask
Go
another
ahead.
question? But do you think that the type of regulate or the type of intervention that's actually productivity increasing for a society that's based on exchange, do you think that type of regulation is at the level of actual legislation and regulation of markets, or do you think it's at a level of political institutions? So, like, the Constitution for this country was very, or we can say in retrospect, was very productivity enhancing. It helped because it created a federalist system, and so there was competition between the states. But since the beginning of the last century, there's been a lot of regulation on a higher level of the political sphere, maybe, and that tends to be efficiency decreasing, I would think. And I don't know if you agree with that, or
Not sure I got all of
it
that.
seems like there are two levels of political institutions: the
Well,
fundamental institutions, and then what's added on.
Well, let's put it another way. Would there ever be a case in which direct economic regulations, which aren't just the rules of the game, but about things like what you can eat, what you can buy, what quality, are in which direct, or even to extreme case, price controls, are there any cases under which, for whatever reasons, they can contribute to adaptive efficiency, even though they might be inefficient in some first best economic sense?
Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I got a good answer to it. My off the top of my head is saying no, but I'll bet you I can think of cases, if I think long enough, that I'd be wrong about, and that it would fit what you're just talking about.
Okay. Thank
But
you.
there are, I mean, all these are very interesting things which we haven't done nearly enough work on to really know what we're talking about. And I urge those of you who are going to go on, you know, and do advanced work in this. These are all kinds of questions I hope you're going to explore, because we have just left wide open an enormous area that is just demanding good hard work.
Others? Yes.
These are all very I'm Kevin Rollins, a Pace Master student. These are all very complex things we're talking about, and I think the model is fantastic, but I wonder about the possibilities for communicating this to even other academics, let alone policy scholars and the political class. How have you found your ability to present these in a way that's understandable to their limited models in their minds?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't have a good answer to you, because with what we've just finished writing, we had long arguments about who should be the audience. It turns out that we think that the audience will be academics and the educated public, educated in the sense of people who are interested in those issues but not academic. We argued with ourselves whether we should write it more in more popular sense, so we'd have a broader audience, because we are interested in attempting to change the way the world works. And I'm not sure we're going to succeed in that. One of the things I've written now 10 books. One of the things I've always hoped I'd get a book that eventually would be popular enough so that it would be read by non-academic, and to some extent they have, but not nearly to the extent that I would like to be able to do it. And I think that's something missing with the way in which we academics try to write. But we have a limited audience. It's not we don't have influence, but the influence is more indirect. We have people who read it, who then translate it into something that is more doable. But I'm not sure we shouldn't do more of that direct ourselves.
Claire?
Doug, you mentioned that you have another project with John starting next that you're
John
working
Nye
on.
or John Wallace?
John Wallace. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about your next projects and how you're continuing the discussion that you started in this book.
Well, I have I'm dissatisfied with the book we've just finished in a number of different things, as indeed are my two co-authors. Let me give you a number of different directions in which we have, all of which we're talking about doing more with. The one I mentioned here was that I don't think that we understand the way in which the mind and brain work properly, and that means what John Wallace and I are thinking about doing is something on the way in which emotions affect decision making and how that modifies the rationality calculus that we use in economics. And that's something we probably are going to do, and we've been doing some work on. Gee, I don't know which one to turn next to. I've got so many. Barry Weingast and I want to ask ourselves a question that will boggle your mind, I think. We want to know, what are the limits to our ability to understand the world around us? One of the things that should bother you if you're an academic like me is, how come we have such widely different understandings of the world, and they don't seem to get reconciled, and indeed we battle away with each other in the academic world all the time, and with a lot of time wasting our time. But what we don't, why can't we understand things better? Now, some of that is a function of the way the mind works and the subjective nature of belief systems and the way they evolve. Some of it is the limited amount of evidence we have with respect to how the world works that is constraining us. Some of it is maybe just fundamental to the way in which we can structure the world to make sense out of it. The structures we have are clearly arbitrary to a substantial degree. Even the one that I talked about with institutions, or what Rostow talked about, or what other people talk about. And what we'd like to know, or what I'd like to know, what are the constraints that are imposed on us that limit our ability to understand the world? I can go on for a long time, but what would you do? I want to hear your answer to that question.
Which one? Well, what projects you're going to do? I can't
No,
answer.
what should we be doing?
You mean, what should you be doing?
Or you'll be doing? You're going to do the same thing.
Well, I mean, as you know, we're talking tomorrow, and we've been talking for a long time about getting more deeply into this question of why do elites ever really permit reform?
Yeah.
And this is something that you really, I think, is never really quite understood. And I think that is tied to the interest both of us have in the role of culture and identity in politics. And I think that it's very important to ask the sort of question that many notions that people have of value have both, if you like, a personal and an instrumental role. And one of the problems we have is that to the extent disagreements about beliefs are instrumental, then once we overcome barriers of information or proof, we can get agreement. The problems become when the differences in values and beliefs are inherent to your identity. So for instance, religion is the most extreme case. That's not just a question about, okay, you believe one thing and I believe another. If it's very fundamental to you to believe that something is right, then both the standard that you will accept before you'll overturn your belief is extremely high. And between two superficially similar beliefs, you have a strong attachment to one that is far above any directly instrumental value. And I think that has a lot to do with how people sort themselves, about how people have notions about what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior, and the notion that in some sense it's simply a matter of mutual understanding misses the point. I think throughout much of history, a lot of progress has come, to be perfectly frank, because the winning coalitions have either devalued or destroyed the values of the losing coalitions. I mean, if you like, many of the religious wars in the 17th century had to do with very strongly exclusive notions of, say, even Protestantism versus Catholicism. To the extent you remove those exclusive notions, you permitted a détente, a peace. But by doing so, you also exclude a kind of view of the world. And if you have a strong view of that world, then you literally have to eliminate that view of the world, which means you have to eliminate, either through their ideas or through their existence, people who believe that. So that a large part of what we think of as progress is sort of saying certain types of populations either should not be allowed to believe what they're allowed to believe, or should not be allowed to communicate those beliefs to the public in some fundamental way. And I think we underestimate the extent to which a lot of even so-called peaceful progress is violent, in the sense that it excludes certain types of beliefs. We may not mind it because we feel we're on the winning side, or we're on the side of the right or the true. But we can't get around the fact that part of that success is precisely eliminating our enemies.
He and I would argue about this. Don't take his word as the gospel. Just take it as half the gospel.
But I don't know. I think that's part of what's
that's
complicated.
Good, but that does complicate. That's right.
And I think ethnicity is a very big part of that. I think disagreements about, the extent to which ethnic minorities are successful are the focus of resentment and discrimination, are tied to the fact that when there's ethnic conflict, a lot of it has to do with the wrong people winning. And issues about jealousy, envy, etc., spite, and so forth, are very hard to deal with in a strict utilitarian context, but are a very big part of the conflict in this world. Last question, perhaps? Douglas? Yes.
Yeah, I'm Jeremy Horpel. I'm a fourth-year PhD student. One thing that kind of struck me in the book right away was you had this table where you listed countries like, say, at between 1,000 and 5,000 per capita income, and then the size of government as a percent of GDP. Got me thinking, when you started talking about the US and Britain and France, that when they made the transition to open access orders, they had per capita income somewhere around $1,000 in today's dollars, but their governments were a much smaller percent of GDP than countries at similar levels of development today. So I'm just wondering if possibly another doorstep condition is small government in terms of GDP. Now that number, it's hard, there's a lot in that number that number doesn't capture, but is that one of the conditions for a number of reasons, or do you think
it's
not?
just the reverse? All open access societies have governments being a substantial proportion.
Right, we're talking about when the transition happens.
Well,
Like
when the transition happened, that's true. Typically, they're small. Mostly because a limited access society can't support a very large government in the way that an open access society. One of the things that has happened, which I think is very interesting and sort of runs counter to some of my right-wing friends, not looking at anybody in particular, is that you can't get an open access society that doesn't extend citizenship to a broader and broader percentage. And as you do, these citizens are going to demand, for good reason, protection against the kind of insecurities that arise with their new status. And you see that. One of the things, the whole growth of the Social Security movement, unemployment insurance, all these kinds of things have evolved over the last 100 years as we've extended citizenship rights, and then these people have demanded more. That's not always been good, but it's been a process, so that the growth of government is an inevitable part of an open access society. Now, you could say, and I think it's probably misunderstood, but there's no doubt that some countries, like the Scandinavian countries, which have a very large share of government, but they've still done so and been quite successful in doing that. But it's a good question. But I think the idea that small governments go with an open access society is just wrong.
But if I could just try to clarify this a little. If you have that growth in government before you make the transition to an open access society, isn't that going to hinder economic growth in some way?
You don't usually find government being big in limited access society, even though governments may be very
pervasive.
Yeah, pervasive, and even though they may be hold people down, they're not a big percentage in GNP. I think I'm right about that. I don't know. I don't think I know.
Well, it's not gonna get into that now. Perhaps we'll continue this later. Douglas will be with us for 4 days, and he will be, of course, lecturing on Thursday with Wallace and Weingast. We'll be around for a couple of days. I don't know if there's any time for the students. I don't know. Claire's the manager. So.
Do you have any other time that we can talk further?
Well, it depends what you'd like to do now. If you'd like to keep talking now, you're perfectly welcome to do that. But if you'd rather see people later,
I think one of the things that happens when you get to my age is that a couple of hours is about
right,
limit.
right. So maybe later.
Well,
this
you young
afternoon.
people will be 15 hours, but